Here's an idea. Serial shows us how journalism might not be objective, but maybe that's okay. Last time on Idea Channel, we talked about objectivity, the law, and the people who practice it. This, I think, is what Serial and even sometimes The Good Wife show us, that though the law might have some objective moral basis, it is still very much open to interpretation. So, objective? Sure, but maybe only to a point. Objective, but complexly so. And maybe that's something Serial shows us. At the end of this video, we'll see what you had to say about last week's video. A video which you don't need to watch in order to understand this one, but it probably wouldn't hurt, especially if you don't know much about the podcast Serial. Because today, we're gonna ask about the other side of Serial's setup. Not the detectives, counsel, experts, or suspects, but its host, journalist Sarah Koenig and her team. Were they, or was Sarah too involved in Adnan's case? Does Serial have some unupheld responsibility to be disinterested? Did they transgress some set of journalistic ethics? This has been a big criticism of Koenig from the start, who, at the beginning of the show, is vocally pro-Adnan.
At this point, I'm going to say flat out that I don't buy the motive for this murder, at least not how the state explained it. I just don't see it.
As the show progresses, her skepticism regarding the potentially lifelong inmate's innocence ebbs and flows, but overall, Serial never fully departs from a narrative that seems to be searching for the bit of evidence to exonerate Adnan of his conviction of his girlfriend Hae Min Lee's murder in 1999. Koenig has said that this wasn't her intention, that she was aware she might potentially uncover something useful, but that the goal of Serial was never explicitly to free Adnan. Criticisms have continued regardless, even after the finale, the way Sarah treated Jay, the fact that she didn't speak with Kevin Urich, the prosecutor in Adnan's case, a thing which she and the Serial team have responded to publicly, and other various and sundry actions or inactions that raise the question of whether Koenig and her producers were really letting all the facts speak for themselves. In other words, being objective. I'm not sure they were. I'm also not sure that that's a problem. But before we talk about why, let's talk for a second about journalistic objectivity. In many Western countries, but particularly in the United States, objectivity is the cornerstone principle of journalism. In a paper for Journalism Studies, Juan Ramón Muñoz-Torres paraphrases David Mindich, who even suggests that without the concept of objectivity, American journalism cannot be understood at all. So let's make sure we understand objectivity. We covered the high-level concepts last week when we were talking about the law. Objectivity is a framework for existence and knowledge free from the knower's own biases. And both of these are still very much at play in journalism as well, but the concept of journalistic objectivity tends to add one more dimension, that of balance. Often our understanding of journalistic objectivity assumes an almost ethical directive. It's viewed as unfair or deceptive if reporting doesn't give equal time to all sides of a story or debate. This expectation is so pervasive that even Idea Channel is often chided for not showing both sides of the story. Luckily, we're not the news, or aiming to be objective, even a little. I can say one side of an argument like it's the truth and move on with a totally clear conscience. Relatedly, as Muñoz-Torres points out, this is all ostensibly in service of the truth. The goal of journalism is to provide insight and accountability where citizens, laws, and politics cannot or do not. And so it goes that the pursuit of that insight or accountability should be neutral, impartial, fair, balanced. But what if the other side of a story is considered marginal at best or dangerous at worst? The BBC, for instance, recently decided to stop giving equal airtime to those denying the effects of climate change. It's also arguable that objectivity is something of a goose that journalists are encouraged to chase. As Glenn Greenwald puts it in No Place to Hide, every news article is the product of all sorts of highly subjective cultural, nationalistic, and political assumptions. Here on Idea Channel, I've said something similar in different terms, that media always reflects the conditions of its production. Or to look at this another way, our sense of journalistic objectivity is one built by applying some romantic, even vaguely scientific concept of rational empiricism to reporting the news. Unfortunately, in journalism and even in science, a perfectly objective basis is untenable. There's no foundation for gathering the facts, which does not rely in some way on the subjective judgments of human beings. None at all. Sorry. But okay, now we are briskly headed down a path towards the unconcludable semantic argument, beginning with the question, but what is truth anyway, man? Glenn Greenwald, again, can provide a pertinent detour. The relevant distinction, he writes, is not between journalists who have opinions and those who have none, a category which does not exist. It's between journalists who candidly reveal their opinions and those who conceal them, pretending they have none. Media critic and NYU journalism professor Jay Rosen has rendered this same sentiment much more succinctly. Transparency, he said, is the new objectivity. For the longest time, objectivity reigned supreme over journalistic practice, but its throne is crumbling. Studies in the US and Europe have shown that practitioners see objectivity as an ideal to strive for, but that there is just as much of a sense that it is an impossible ideal. This, I think, is an industry-wide almost neurosis that Serial wears on its sleeve. There are many things that you can say Serial did less than perfectly, but I think, to its credit, I never felt like Sarah Koenig or her producers were any more or less sure or unsure about the story than they clearly expressed. To hear Koenig's description of the process of digging through court documents and evidence, tracking people down, talking to experts, developing leads, and testing them against the materials at her disposal, alongside her various convictions, beliefs, skepticisms, and intentions, I catch glimpses of a journalistic process which I think lets the facts and the reporter speak at the same time. Of course, transparency is not a binary value, but a scalar one. Serial's transparent knob might not have been cranked all the way to 11, but their efforts felt significant and honest. But I don't know. Maybe I'm just being naive. Maybe journalism does have some impossible objective ideal, but its base aims, fairness, accountability, investigation, communication, are no less inherently subjective. Meaning objective journalism, like, I don't know, plastic glasses, a small crowd, or things that are pretty ugly, can exist, but only in spite of what it first appears to be. What do you guys think? Can and should journalism be objective? Were Sarah and her team objective? Let us know in the comments, and it would be objectively nice of you if you were to subscribe. It is objectively very snowy in New York City right now. Let's see what you guys had to say about objectivity, Serial, and the law. As tends to be the case on Idea Channel, when there is some cataclysmic weather event like there is in New York City right now, you get to see the inside of my apartment a little bit more, so that's why you are not looking at the record wall or the Idea Channel set, because I am stuck at home. Anyways, it's not gonna stop us from responding to comments. But before we do, office hours is a thing that we figured out. February 7th at the IBM Pavilion in Midtown in Manhattan. I'm gonna hang out for a couple hours. There's no set plan, just come hang out, chat with me, talk with other Idea Channel viewers. Just have fun, we'll hang out, come for 10 minutes, come for a couple hours. It would be nice to meet you. Okay, on to comments. Eric Velas makes the really great point that whether or not the law is based on objective moral truths, what we're talking about here is what objectively happened, and it shouldn't factor in that people are biased in some way when trying to figure out just what happened, and that there is some objective truth to that. And that might be true, but I think, you see, especially in a Serial, that there's no way to get to that objective truth without passing through the conduit of very subjective, biased, confused, forgetful people. And yeah, I mean, that's right, that is the whole tension here. And the conversation that follows this comment is so good, I highly recommend checking it out. Links to this comment and all the rest in the doobly-doo. Vinyakasa, who talks about Michel Foucault and the idea of objectivity as it is sort of imposed or developed by institutions, and also sort of offers advice of the question of, it might be more worthwhile to ask whether or not the idea of objectivity is important or worthwhile or good. And this made me think of a passage that I have underlined in the Michel Foucault reader that, because I'm home, I could just pull off of my bookshelf and read. It says, the power of the norm, as in normality, appears through the disciplines, right? So these are the disciplines of these institutions. Is this the new law of modern society? Let us say, rather, that since the 18th century, it has joined other powers, the law, the word, and the text, tradition, imposing new delimitations on them. And then a little bit further down says, like surveillance, and with it, normalization becomes one of the great instruments of power at the end of the classical age. And this is basically all about how the normalization of culture and behavior through the existence of institutions is effectively law, which I think is a very important and great comment. Thank you for this comment. Ernest Petty talks about how one of the things that you could say is attractive about the law is its sense of objectivity, that there is this sense that it is not different for different people, and that can provide a sort of sense of justness or a basis for justice, but that there are certain situations where it becomes clear that maybe the law is different for different people, and that those events and situations are incredibly important because they might inspire in us an interest or a sense that we can and should try to change the way things are, and that maybe Serial factors into that in some way. And I would say yes, and yeah, I agree. Laurel Teal brings up the idea of the social contract, which I definitely should have mentioned by name. It's the idea that there is sort of a contract between all people in a society to behave in a certain way, and talks about how that is maybe both expressive of and kind of upholding of the ideas that contribute to the existence of law, but that also another thing worth considering is that our ideas about how these things should be objective probably say just as much about our culture and society as what happens when we attempt that objectivity as the results that we get from it. And finally, and relatedly, Sarah Wint talks about how it is maybe the reaching for objectivity that is the most important thing, that as the idea of what it means to be human, what it means to be a human around other humans, changes and progresses, and we uncover more understanding about it, our idea of what is right, what is objectively right, will necessarily change. And that this idea of objectivity in the law is sort of like utopia, that, you know, it's a nice idea to reach for. You probably are never going to get there, but maybe it doesn't hurt to try. Fair. This week's episode was brought to you by the hard work of Objectively, the best editing team in New York City. We have a Facebook and IRC and a subreddit links in the doobly-doo. And the tweet of the week comes from TJ Von P, who let me know that Serial is not an NPR show, which I should have known as someone who works in public media. This is very embarrassing for me. I will do penance. 10 Hail Terrys and 1 hour Lehrer. How's that? Sound good? I think that's fair.